Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our conversation on redeeming justice. I'm Zinelle October, the Executive Vice President for the American Constitution Society, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this important conversation today. Before we dive in, I want to quickly introduce ACS folks to who may be new. The American Constitution Society, ACS, is the country's foremost progressive legal organization with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year of shaping national legal debates, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring the law is the force to improve the lives of all people. We are dedicating this anniversary year to race and the Constitution, and to reckoning with the past for a more just future. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow ACS on social media, included on Twitter at ACS Law, and subscribe to ACS's new podcast, Broken Law. You can also find us online at acslaw.org. There you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities. I'd like to thank our 19 student and lawyer chapters for co-sponsoring this important program. You see them on the screen or in the chat box. Thank you also to Steve Wright and Jarrett Adams, two incredible ACS friends, tireless leaders for real reform. I'm honored to share the virtual stage with them. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Today's program examines the criminal injustice system. We'll hear from Steve Wright, who teaches at Georgetown Law and Yale Law School, and was the 2017 ACS Progressive Champion. Prior to teaching, Steve was the president and senior counsel at the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta. Steve will discuss his life's work on capital punishment, indigent defense, prison conditions, and race and criminal justice. We'll also hear from Jarrett Adams, who was exonerated after serving nearly a decade in prison and then put himself through school and became an attorney to help others wrongfully incarcerated. After graduating from Loyola in Chicago, Jarrett clerked at the Seventh Circuit, a courthouse that exonerated him. He then worked at the Innocence Project of New York and now at the law office of Jarrett Adams, PLLC, where he works in both federal and state courts. He's the author of Redeeming Justice, From Defendant to Defender, My Fight for Equity on Both Sides of a Broken System, which inspired today's program. The book will be released on September 14th and is available for pre-order now at the link in the chat box. We'll start with Steve. You're no stranger to many here, and I understand there will soon be a book released written by Robert Tsai about your life and work as an advocate for the poor. But can you please share a little bit about your career path and explain what drew you to your work in indigent defense and advocating for those subject to the criminal legal system?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I had the great fortune to be both a legal services lawyer and a public defender, legal services at Appalachian Research and Defense Fund in the coalfields of Appalachia, and then the District of Columbia Public Defender program service. But then I went south and spent 35 years at the Southern Center for Human Rights, practicing primarily on capital cases, but also looking at the criminal legal system in terms of the representation that people were getting in all kinds of cases, and also doing a lot of work in the prisons and jails in the South. I got to know Jarrett about 5 or 6 years ago at an ACS meeting. I followed him as he's gone to law school, as he's become an attorney, and I had the pleasure of reading his book, and I recommend it to everybody who's watching.
Certainly echo that. I had the pleasure of reading it as well. It's an excellent read and it's a must read. And Steve, thank you so much for all the work that you do. So incredible to have you here. And Jarrett, we'll go more into your story shortly, but can you describe the work that you're doing now in client advocacy, your current efforts for reform?
Yeah, well, thank you guys. I want to thank you all for always including me in the conversation. I mean, it's always an honor to be on with Steve. I say that with all sincerity. You know, he was someone that I looked up to before we even met. And I'll get into that as well a little later. Right now, what I'm doing is, right now I have 3 offices. I have office in Chicago, in New York, Milwaukee, and I'm working on a 4th office out in LA. And what I've found in my practice is this: that problem, that issue of representation is real, it's rampant, and there's just, it's not enough being done to address it. 80% of the people who are charged with crimes can't afford an attorney. And, it's not to say, it's not indicative to say that, public defense, like public defenders are not good. That's not the case at all. I was in an office with some amazing public defenders. The issue is that they're overworked, overwhelmed, and underfunded. And so when you have 80% of the population relying on that, you have a real problem within our system. So realizing that in my practice, we now have shifted now to the creation of Life After Justice, which is a nonprofit, and it operates on 3 tiers. We do 3 things. One of the babies of the organization is that we operate as a smaller innocence organization where we litigate cases that have the chance to create the precedent to keep us from getting where we continue to get to with the oversights and the gray areas within the law. We also focus on the repairing of folks who similarly are situated to how I was when I came home. And a lot of that focus includes heavily on mental health care. I think that, and we can get into that a little bit later on as well, I think that there's no real talk about reforming our criminal justice system if we aren't including the mental health care world as well. That needs to be hand in hand. And also what we're doing with the nonprofit is we're trying to get, laws, statutes on the books that me and Steve, Steve has been doing this longer than I have. There are some obvious fixes, Zinelle, that they just aren't being fixed, and so as much as I can, and that was a long-winded way of answering your question, but what I'm doing each and every day with my Life After Justice is just trying to make a difference and inspire others the same way Steve inspired me, because we need everyone in a situation as big as it is in our criminal justice system with the many issues.
Thank you. Well, we're so grateful that you're doing such incredible work. So our thanks. And we're so thrilled to have you both here. You've done a few ACS events for us together. Way back in 2017, you were both at National Convention, and Jarrett presented Steve with the ACS Progressive Champion Award. We have a one-minute clip we want to share.
For over 35 years, Steve Wright has worked diligently and tirelessly at the Southern Center for Human Rights. There, he's provided adequate representation to the indigent, the powerless, and oftentimes those who are forgotten. I first became aware of Steve and his work in 2002. After seeing him on C-SPAN, he was testifying against the use of the death penalty in America. Now, this testimony took on an entirely different meaning for me, because I was watching it from a maximum security prison, 3 years into a 28-year sentence for a crime that I did not commit.
Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties.
Seeing that fiery passion, it encouraged me. It encouraged me to continue to fight and to prove my own innocence. And after nearly a
Okay, we just wanted to share a little bit of that clip. We'll continue. Jarrett, can you share with us what happened that led to your being in prison? Specifically, having read your book, I'm struck by the inexperience of your lawyer and their lack of a defense strategy. Could you explain what happened?
Yeah, I also want to say too, my face was a lot less fatter back then in 2017 when I look at that video. But no, that was a good memory and a great night. And it was an honor to present Steve with that award. So I was a 17-year-old kid. I was falsely accused of a sexual assault along with 2 of my friends. And this was a juvenile encounter that, resulted in a false claim, and the system's setup and failures allowed me to be assigned an attorney off of a panel list. This panel list of attorneys had no checks and balances. So I had an attorney who didn't have experience. As a matter of fact, he was not that far out of law school when he had handled my case. And simply put, the evidence of my innocence, which was a statement that was withheld by the police, if he would have hired an investigator, he would have been able to uncover this. And this was a baseless accusation where I didn't know as a 17-year-old that the truth wasn't enough in our criminal justice system. And it was one of these things where I got the firsthand experience to see that justice in many ways is for sale. And my mother couldn't afford this attorney. One of my friends who could afford an attorney, his attorney ended up filing motion after motion after motion, which ultimately resulted in his charges being dismissed after we discovered that the police withheld this statement from us initially in the beginning. And we had to appeal, 6-7 more years until the conviction was finally reversed. And during that stint, it was many days that I just didn't feel like fighting. Just to be honest with you, I just didn't feel like I was tired. But I just remember how my mother continued to blame herself for not being able to afford me an attorney. And I remember, I never forget, I was pacing back and forth in my cell, and that's when I saw Steve Wright come on, and he was talking about the death penalty. He was talking about it in a way that it wasn't a rehearsal for him. This was someone talking about it because you could tell that he didn't start work at 9 and stop at 5. You could tell that he was taking some of his clients home and the stories home with him because he was able to respond and talk about the issue in depthly. And so, things like that, moments like that along the way continue to encourage me to fight. And I knew that one day, if I continued to go forward, I would have the opportunity to share my insight to hopefully help fix some of the shortcomings that we have in our criminal justice system. I ended up, doing almost 10 years. And I say that because I add in the jail, the county jail time as well. And I just kept saying to myself, the court will get it right. It'll get it right. And it didn't. And so when I left out, graduated, law school, spent time in the same circuit that overturned my conviction, I did all of this not to impress, anyone. I did it to impress upon society what it is we may be losing with our over-incarceration in the United States.
Well, Jarrett, thank you for that response and for opening us up this way to get some context here. Steve, I'd like to turn to you for a moment because, as you know, we're a group of mostly law students and lawyers. Did Jarrett's experience with the system and specifically his attorney shock you?
I'm sorry to say not. No, as Jarrett said a moment ago, and I would second it, there are certainly public defender offices all around the country that are doing great work and that are preventing innocent people from being convicted. But there are a lot of places where there are no public defenders, where like Jarrett, a person gets a lawyer on a list, and in a lot of places, any lawyer can sign up to take court-appointed cases. And a lot of times they're signing up because that's the only thing they can do. And the other thing that a lot of people miss about this is they're appointed by the presiding judge in many places. It's a big country and there are a lot of differences, but in an awful lot of places, judges appoint lawyers who are more loyal to the judge than they are to their client. They know that the judge wants to get the cases through in a hurry. They don't want a lot of motions. They don't want continuances. And so they may not do everything that they should do for that reason. And it may be that judges don't appoint lawyers who really give someone a vigorous defense. I remember a number of years ago when the district attorney in Atlanta testified before a legislative committee and said he learned very early when he was in private practice how to avoid getting court-appointed cases. He said, you do a good job in a couple of those cases and they won't bother you anymore. You won't have any more cases to worry about. So one of the things we have to have is independent lawyers, independent of the judge and the prosecutor, public defender offices, because in many places and in serious cases, I mean, a person would think that in the most serious cases, people would get the best lawyers, but that's just not the case. In Houston, Texas, we've had 3 death penalty cases where the lawyers slept during the trial. We've had capital and other cases where lawyers were intoxicated or under the influence of drugs. Far too many cases where there was no investigation, no work on the case. And so a person is very much up to sort of the luck of the draw. You can get a very competent lawyer in some jurisdictions where there is a good public defender office and where they're dedicated public defenders, and you may be somewhere else and get a lawyer like Jarrett had.
Well, that's a lot. And fortunately, we have 2 amazing lawyers like you and many in our network. And Steve, the issue that you bring up about the judges is a really, really important one, and one that ACS cares about a lot. So thank you for raising that. Jarrett, now after your incredible journey, you're advocating for clients who are in very similar situations to what you faced. Is there advice and counsel that you're able to give, which you wished you had received when you were the client facing years in prison?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough doing these cases on the back end, on post conviction. You know, I liken it to like trying to unring a bell. You know, for whatever reason, the system in many ways operates in let's preserve finality before we, you know, go and find out the truth, right? And on post conviction, you're up against it. I mean, when the jury or a bench trial, you've been found guilty, it's just so difficult. So one of the things that I am able to do with my practice is this. Like I said, I cannot, you know, I cannot state and stress enough that the family and the community are the unspoken victims of our criminal justice system, right? So one of the things that I'm able to offer in my practice is this. I do many client calls with family included, because the anxiety of not knowing is what drives many people, you know, crazy and not just able to deal with it. And then there's also this, you know, I don't just want to see people get out. I want to see people thrive when they get out. And that's why the family has to be along for the journey and the education of, you know, the post-conviction work and how difficult it is. You know, we, you know, at Life After Justice and what we're doing, we are also offering mental health care to the family, because they're not therapists, they're not reentry specialists, but they love their loved one. And so they, in many ways, accept people right out of these prison institutions where we know not the best of reintegration skills are being taught. And so, you know, I oftentimes am speaking with mothers, you know, and I daydream a bit, you know, because I know what it was like to speak to my mother, you know, and I know what it was like for her. She was spending money out of her 401k to try to get me a post-conviction attorney. And we didn't know what we were doing, Zinelle. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know anything about post-conviction work. We didn't know what we were doing. And so a lot of what I do in the practice is I don't just represent the client. I also will educate the family, inform the family, because the idea of just getting someone out is half the battle. Reintegrating back into society and doing it successfully is another huge fight of it. And you know, I just got off the phone with the client, actually, a client's father. I'm working on this case in Waverly, Virginia, and it's starting to pick up a lot of steam. We're working with the Attorney General, you know, to really just, you know, let's try to figure something out before we get to court, because we know what the evidence, you know, tells us. And the reason why I bring this up is because the father's, you know, the client's father just, you know, recently got off of a ventilator, you know, dealing with COVID. And, you know, even on the ventilator, he would want to know and have updates about what's going on. just because that anxiety was killing me. He told me, he said, listen, I just want you to do one thing. I just want you to I just want a hug from him outside of that place before I die. And it was good to have this call with him today, because he's now off the ventilator, doing a lot better. But, in terms of what I do, and I think that the skill set that I'll offer, I think I offer that compassion and that knowing firsthand how not knowing is just a killer in these cases that drag on forever.
I'm so glad you brought up that point about the compassion, and these are human beings going through this experience, and how tough it is. And Steve, I've heard you speak at many of our ACS programs about the importance of that. And do you want to speak to that a bit?
Well, I mean, in terms of, as Jarrett said, trying to deal with these cases, particularly now in the post-conviction stage on appeal or in habeas corpus, it's almost impossible. When I started doing the work in 1979 on capital cases, at that time, you could actually get into federal court and get before a life tenure federal judge, somebody like Frank Johnson, a great judge on the 11th Circuit, and you actually could see vindication of the Constitution. But that's been cut back so much by the court and by the Congress that it's very, very hard to do. And what we need, as Jarrett said, is upfront. I mean, you can look at Virginia. Virginia has carried out more executions than any state except Texas in the modern history of the death penalty, that is since 1926. And all these people are being sentenced to death in Virginia, and they were all being processed through in post-conviction and were executed. And then they created in the early 2000s regional capital defender offices, 4 of them, that provided people with competent lawyers at the start of the process instead of at the end. And what happened is, starting in 2011 until now, nobody was sentenced to death in Virginia. And finally, earlier this year, Virginia repealed its death penalty statute. That was all about the right to counsel. That was about providing people competent lawyers at the start of the process, which kept people from being sentenced to death instead of spending a lot of time and resources. Not that it, if somebody's on death row or somebody's wrongfully convicted, certainly that has to be challenged. But we have to look at ways to get ahead of this in order to prevent people from being convicted if they're innocent, and people from being sentenced to death in those cases.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Jarrett, I want to shift gears just a bit. Something that never ceases to amaze me and all of my colleagues here about your story is how you transformed yourself from defendant to defender. You've rebuilt your life without any help from the system that wrongfully convicted you. You've never been compensated for a day stolen. Indeed, that description, defendant to defender, is in the title of your book. You were and are literally up against an entrenched, unjust system, one that took almost 10 years of your life. How did you have the strength to make this transformation and endure your experience such that you can now advocate for others, especially in the way that you do?
Yeah. The true answer with no sugar is I wanted my lick back, okay, for me and my mother. Like, that was, I'm raised by these women, my mom, my aunts, my grandmother, like literally had no idea that the real superheroes were right in my house. And so for my mother not to be able to go to church and enjoy her favorite seat because everybody there was asking, hey, how's Jarrett doing? And it just became too difficult, for her to answer that question. I saw what it did to my family. I saw how we went from these cookouts and fish fries to, I'm visiting people at care homes, dialysis treatments, you name it. And so it angered me. But what I realized was that, me swinging a punch isn't going to have an impact like me swinging this law degree, right? And so with the encouragement, of my family to address, the mental impact that, this experience had on me, I kept going. I mean, you know, I didn't know, you know, I would have, you know, the opportunity to, you know, matriculate through as I did. It wasn't seamless. I mean, it was difficult to get here, but I realize now more than ever in the practice that I'm doing, I'm getting the opportunity to do something that I promised my family I would. And I just remember my mother, you know, crying when I got the degree. Uh, and I'm like, well, you know, we're done crying, right? And she was like, no, you know, I'm crying because I know that there's going to be some other mother who's not able to afford an attorney. And I know that you just ain't gonna go out here and start a practice all about money. You're gonna give back and help folks. Now that was her way of saying what I'm gonna do. That wasn't what, you know, so, but she's right. And it's important. And so now what I'm really trying to do right now is this. And Steve pointed out something very important about, you know, judges and stuff like that and lawyers and all of that. You know, there's a high percentage, and I don't know exactly the percentage right offhand of judges, you know, who are former prosecutors and AUSA attorneys and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that former prosecutors cannot be fair judges, but what I am saying is, why can't we have equality? Why can't there be a fair balance of both former public defenders that are judges as well? Because you get the perspective from both sides when you have diversity in our judiciary. And so, you know, what I hope and what I pray with the book, and the reason why I wrote it and what I'm doing now, I just pray I spark a generation of, you know, young attorneys, you know, who won't just accept something and will litigate for their rights and not be afraid. This country was founded on litigation. We see things that are not right. We need a new crop, a new generation to come and carry the torch the rest of the way. And I specifically hope and pray that young African-American males can look and see what I've been able to do and understand that it may not seem like it, but it is easier to go through what I went through and become an attorney like I am today than it is to be a #1 pick in any draft. NFL, NBA, you name it. It is difficult to do that and be any type of entertainer as well. And we need more lawyers. We need more voices. We need more people, more stories to be able to get folks who are ever on the right or on the left to meet in the middle where justice is truly at.
Thank you for that. And you kind of seg nicely to my next question for Steve, especially given the network that we have and thinking of the next generation and current lawyers, looking globally at our system, what can we as progressive lawyers do to help people who are reentering society after having been in prison? Are there unique challenges facing those who have been wrongfully convicted?
Well, there are certainly unique challenges for those, and it's an incredible adjustment, whether they were wrongfully convicted or not. There are many people who were convicted of crimes that they may have committed, but they're coming back into society, and it's an incredible adjustment to be made. Anthony Ray Hinton was talking about when he first was riding in a car with someone, this lady kept giving directions, and you want to know where she was. Never heard that sort of, what everybody takes for granted with directions, the GPS system and so forth. One example of what can be done with this that I know about is Mike Romano, who's a professor at Stanford Law School and runs the 3 Strikes project there. This is a project that deals not with innocent people, but people that got extremely harsh sentences under California's notorious 3 Strikes law. About every 2 weeks, I get an email from Mike saying that there's another person going home, another person who they've gone to court and been able to get a reduction of their sentence. But this was a big problem with adjustment. So what they did was involve many of the people that had been released earlier and now working with those who are being released today to help make that adjustment, because society has changed so much for people who've been locked up 25 or 30 years. People who've been locked up since they were children and have now been, everything has changed. And so it's very important that we have reentry programs to help people. And that's one of the best examples that I know of.
Thank you. And
Zinelle,
Jarrett, yeah, same to you, because
I was,
I know you're very interested in reentry, Jarrett. I would love to.
yeah, and I was gonna say this too, because Steve just sparked something that I said before. So I want people who are looking at this, I want you to think about if something in your house breaks, right? You will usually know how to fix it, right? Because it's in your house, you're familiar with it, you've used it for quite some time. Whether or not it's fixed depends on usually the resources, right? Do you buy a new one? Do you prepare to get it repaired? So I say that to say this: the criminal justice system is broken. The people who know how to fix it are the people who are closely impacted to it. Those are the people who are inside and who've gone through it, and the family members of those who supported people through it. Why are they, us, not in those leadership positions if you're trying to fix this thing, right? So reentry must include a holistic approach of requesting and putting people in place who went through it to help guide us through it. I could use another analogy. A lot of times in sports, the best coaches are former players. I can go on and go on and on. So, I was a heck of an investigator, which really has my lawyering skills and realizing that, look, a lot of what lawyers do is investigating, right? So it's things like that where I really hope that we can move in a direction where we do not allow the historical depictions and narratives of folks who go in and out of prison to keep us from asking those folks like myself, how do we fix this thing, right? And the couple simple things is this: you can't spend the majority of your budget on corrections and expect, that people are going to be prepared when they are released. And what I mean by corrections is, the budget is heavily spent on building prisons and maintaining prisons. It's not, on how do I get these people as quickly as prepared as possible to reenter society and be productive as possible. And so, it's that thing right there. And that, a lot of the narrative and the depiction, of folks who go in and out of prison is really what's keeping us from getting the immediate changes that we need in our criminal justice system. Yeah, we looked at. I don't know if anyone else is paying attention like we are, who are all on the Zoom, but if locking people up was the key to safety, then why aren't we able to keep our doors unlocked anymore?
Okay. Just a reminder or notification to the audience members that in about 10 minutes, we'll start taking your questions. So feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. And Steve and Jarrett, this next question is for both of you. We know that high quality legal defense and advocacy is critical if those subject to our criminal legal system are to have any hope at justice. But far too often, these are the same people who do not have the resources to get that high quality legal defense, as Jarrett indicated was his experience. Given the enormous demand, how do you choose which cases you take in your current practice?
I'll go first.
Yeah.
So really what this is about is this: we're fundraising right now with the nonprofit to staff out people to take on more cases. So we're able to take, cases when we have a budget. And we also, like I said, we try to focus on, if there's a case that will allow us to, through litigation, stand up in front of Congress or somewhere and get a statute implemented. I'll give you an example. For years and years, folks in Chicago, lawyers in Chicago, have been trying to do away with the deception that officers can use when interrogating kids. Like they were able to go online, just go right into an interrogation room and say, Johnny told me you did it. And it would produce juveniles, to say things and make statements that were incriminating, even though a lot of them through DNA, have been found to have been innocent once, the conviction and all that type of stuff was reversed. And so it's stuff like that that we need to quickly and expeditiously move towards getting rid of and curing, right? And we could do it, if we take the politics out of it, right? We could do it. I think that we know that 80-something% of people who are currently incarcerated will one day be released, right? So it's in our best interest to make sure that society, whose dollar is paying for these institutions and these prisons, I think it's for us right now to demand that things inside of those prisons in our criminal justice system, we get more bang for our buck, so to speak. And I think that we are moving slowly there, but we need to get there faster. And I think that we can get there faster if we have an all hands on deck approach. And what I mean by that is we need to get big law involved, right? And involved in this area. There are a lot of law firms who are doing pro bono work in the criminal justice field. We need all of them. You understand what I'm saying? And I don't say this to say, oh, well, that's too far-fetched. Well, look, we had everybody stop what they were doing, well, mostly, to try to tackle this pandemic, right? We had everybody. For a second, all politics stopped because humanity together saw that we needed to address something that is affecting humanity, no matter your color, creed, whatever. We need that same approach with the criminal justice system. We know that in many instances, juveniles' interactions with the legal system only set them up to go on to the adult correctional system. And so those are some of the things that we try to focus on, is taking a case where if we're able to litigate it, we're able to show, look, here's what happened in this case. We need to create a law so this doesn't happen anymore.
Thank you. And Steve, can you give us a sense of how you decide which cases you're able to?
Sure. I think what we really just have to have is more offices like those capital defenders that I described in Virginia. Because what happens, I know when I was at Southern Center, we would usually base taking cases on who was most desperate, who was closest to an execution date without a lawyer, or who was desperate in some other way. And of course, that's not a satisfying thing in some ways, because you want to, of course, intervene in those cases, but there's so many other cases that there are just too many. And the key is to have more and more independent, adequately funded organizations that are providing representation to people who are in the criminal legal system, and to have more lawyers like Jarrett. And I remember at that ACS meeting in 2015, I met Jarrett and I met Theodore Shaw.
Yeah, Theo.
African-American man who'd been one of the Gina Six. And like Jarrett, he too was going to law school. In fact, I ran into him just this morning here at Georgetown. He's a fellow at Georgetown and about to go to the public defender here in the district. So Jarrett, I thought you'd be interested in that.
He just texted me this morning too.
Okay, yeah. So he's doing. We need more people. I said at the ACS that year. I remember I asked you both to come up on the stage, and I said, "This is what we need. We need people like this who've had experience with the system and whoever had experience with it, and who are committed and dedicated to providing the best possible representation to clients. The criminal legal system is the part of society least affected by the civil rights movement. Tremendous need for more good lawyers to get in these positions and take on these cases and change offices and improve what's going on so that we can try to avoid what happened to Jarrett happening to other people.
Well, thank you. And we've started getting some audience questions, some of which I'll begin asking you if that's all right. One of them is, what can people do to help if they're not lawyers but are interested in these issues? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you can always find an organization to donate either your money or your time. You know, also something simple to do is this. You know, I think that we have conversations amongst our peers, and sometimes, you know, people, you know, hold their opinions to themselves. I think that it's okay to have conversations, you know, amongst your peers about things that you know are wrong. I think that what we've been forced to do through the pandemic and watching, you know, what happened with George Floyd is we were forced now to not avoid, you know, conversations that, you know, so easily were to be, you know, avoided, you know, and not want to deal with it because of the difficulty of it. And I just think that, you know, we need to bottle that energy up, the energy of change that came out of it, because the momentum, a lot of times, it slows down. And so for folks wanting to get involved, I would say this is what I would say. The criminal justice system is huge. Get involved in your jurisdiction first. I think that anyone, lawyer or no lawyer or not a lawyer, go to your criminal courthouse on a Monday and just sit in the back and just observe, right? Just see, you know, who goes in and who comes out. Just take notice of the lawyers, right? Take notice of how, you know, the clients usually are predominantly of color, and the lawyers, you know, are not a lot of times. And so take that back to your neighborhood and start small, right? You can have a ACS Constitution Day. I'll come and speaking in your neighborhood, or you could reach out to Steve Wright. You could start to have these conversations earlier with the youth, because at the end of the day, the youth, the ACS lawyer chapters, the student chapters who are on right now, like you guys are the ones that are gonna have to carry the torch the rest of the way. When Steve mentioned that he was working in 1979, man, I wasn't even born yet. You understand? So it's like to have Steve here now, spending this time, and he's right with what he did with me and Theo and reaching out, and that is what I'm saying in terms of you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. You don't have to be a lawyer to have a conversation. You don't have to be a lawyer to support a new group. You know, it doesn't always have to be the same, you know, organization. Support, you know, a new group. Support, you know, you can start an organization, you know, inside of your own neighborhood, an ACS chapter. So I think that there's multiple ways to get involved, but I think that you just have to get involved to really, you know, to really make an impact. And no small thing is really small in this big issue that we're dealing with in the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Steve, do you have thoughts on how?
Well, I'd add just a footnote to what Jarrett said. I mean, there are in many places now organizations that are doing great work, and much of the work that they're doing is not being done by lawyers, but by interns or volunteers or people who are employed as investigators or paralegals or whatever. Organizations like the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, Arch City Defenders in St. Louis, but also many public defender offices all around the country. And it provides people with an opportunity to channel. You know, Jarrett said he worked as an investigator. He's a better lawyer because he was an investigator. We had people work as investigators at Southern Center for 4 or 5 years and then go to law school, or decide they didn't want to go to law school, one or the other. But it was a way in which they were immensely helpful in investigating cases and preparing cases and dealing with these issues that we've been talking about. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. Another program that we had was court watching, sending people to court, sort of like Jarrett mentioned a moment ago, and just simply watching what happens in court and making notes of it and so forth. We would say basically go count the constitutional violations. People would go to court and we'd see that they weren't providing people with lawyers, or there were all sorts of other things going on that was patently unconstitutional or illegal, and yet it was happening because nobody was standing up and doing anything about it. And once we learned about it, then we could try to do something about it. So I think there are a lot of opportunities like that.
Great, thank you. And Jarrett, this audience question is for you. Did you
Mhm.
have any issues getting licensed to practice law with the wrongful conviction?
No, I haven't, and I'm licensed in 3 states. I mean, it's just, look, when my conviction was overturned, my record was expunged. So even though the record was expunged, the impact was not. So the impact was there. I still had to explain to people, where I had been for 10 years, right? There was a 10-year gap in my resume. So I didn't have an issue at all in terms of, interviewing and character and fitness and all of that, just being straightforward, as I advise all students who are going and getting ready to go and do character and fitness and all of that type of stuff. Just be transparent about everything. And that's what I was, and didn't have an issue at all with being admitted to the bar.
Great, thank you. This next audience question is for both of you. What role, if any, can restorative justice programs, pretrial diversion, and problem-solving courts play in reducing the high levels of incarceration?
What? It's hugely impactful. Hugely impactful, because I like, this is me telling you guys from being in there. It in no way at all, in no way, helps you reintegrate back into society. You're talking about prisons that are predominantly miles and miles and miles away from the inner city. Most of the people that are housed there, family members and, arrests took place in the inner city. So people are housed there in conditions that have taken all of the programming out. You name it, right? I think the only thing that's really there is like GED, because it's required by courts, but there's not a lot of programming there. And phone calls cost so much. So people literally could be in prison and talk to their family like once or twice a year for 10 years. And then they're released and told, now you go interact and reacclimate and don't come back here again. It makes, absolutely no sense, and so I think that what we should do is, when you look at the pie chart of the budget, that the Department of Justice spends, like I said, that pie chart is heavily on quote unquote corrections. Those corrections are just about locking people up, maintaining the prison. This is what I want to see. And this is the best way for me to answer that question, right? Somebody has to prove me wrong on this. We just saw a war on drugs help create mass incarceration to the tune of 2-point-something million people incarcerated, 900,000 almost Black men. And we spent a lot of money doing it. I want to see the same amount of money spent on pretrial diversions, on a pot for training for attorneys who are going to be assigned cases, a pot for investigators, experts, and stuff like that for the indigent. We have a system right now that is bullying the indigent. And it's always been like this, because when it was created, the indigent were not at the table when it was created. And so I think that someone prove me wrong and show me that spending all of the money on therapy, rehabilitation, show me that won't work, because the people over in Switzerland seem to be on to something right now.
Right, well, thank you for that. Steve, this next question is for you, I think. Could you speak to whether there's any hope for abolishing the death penalty?
Well, the death penalty inevitably will be abolished. I mean, you look at what happened in Virginia, these offices ultimately shut down the death penalty. By the time Virginia repealed the death penalty earlier this year, there were only 2 people on death row in Virginia. In my time at this work, we've seen the number of death sentences imposed each year go from 315 in 1996 until the last few years, when it's been 30 or 40 or even less. So we're going in that direction. We're not going to turn and go in the other direction, because you see the repeal of Virginia. Before that, it was Colorado. Before that, it was Hampshire. More and more states are banning the death penalty. The sad part about it is that it's probably going to linger for quite a while. I don't know when we'll finally, make permanent and absolute and unequivocal the injunction, "Thou shalt not kill." But I think just as we saw things turn very quickly in Virginia, we're going to see that in other states. There are a lot of states that have the death penalty on the books, but haven't used it in 10 years or so.
Yeah.
It's just simply a matter of people at some point doing what the people in Virginia did, which is say, we don't need this. It costs too much. It takes too long. It risks the execution of innocent people. And we're killing all these people. We don't have anything to show for it in terms of making our society safer. So I think it's going to happen. I think the more we all work at trying to bring that about, hopefully we'll be. But I'm, in my heart, I feel pretty confident that the death penalty is, on the wrong side of history. It's going to be over one of these days.
Hey, Zinelle, do you mind if I ask Steve a question?
Oh, please.
So Steve, this is what I wanted to know, right? So now you've been doing this for so long and handling all of these death penalty cases, and this was pre-DNA. So are there some particular cases that you think about right now where you're saying, man, if we would have had this DNA science around, while we were litigating this death penalty case, maybe, we could have done something in this case?
Well, sure. And if we'd had a lot of other resources, one of the things that I think is interesting about Virginia is the courts were always saying in those other cases where people were sentenced to death, and there'd be a question of whether the lawyer was ineffective. And the federal courts, and particularly the Fourth Circuit, would say, well, it didn't make any difference. The guy would have gotten the death penalty, even if the lawyers had done the investigation or put on the evidence. Well, we know that's just simply not true. When these offices were established and they started doing the investigation and putting on the evidence, no one got sentenced to death. Of course, we've had a number of people sentenced to death who were exonerated. It used to be learned hand said, don't worry about innocent people. It doesn't happen. Innocent people are not convicted in our legal system. Well, it's completely wrong. DNA is proven conclusively in case after case. Starting with Kurt Bloodsworth in first person exonerated by DNA evidence. Terrible case, a child who was killed, and but there was a semen stain, and when it was tested, well, it wasn't Bloodsworth, it was somebody else committed the crime. And of course, there have been many since then. I think that's what's really shaken a lot of people's faith, and justifiably so, in the system. Is that we know for sure that we've convicted a lot of innocent people. I have no doubt we've executed innocent people, like Cameron Todd Willingham in Texas, arson. Case. He was not guilty of arson. There's a book called The Wrong Carlos by Jim Liebman and students at Columbia Law School, another wrongful conviction case of a man who was executed. I think a lot of people say, we've got to be more humble about this system. It shouldn't be making life and death decisions, because you can let a fellow out after 30 years, like Anthony Ray Hinton, but you can't bring a guy back to life after they've been executed.
Indeed.
Thank you. We're almost at time, but I want to give you both an opportunity to share any final thoughts with the audience that you might have. So Jarrett, why don't we turn to you first?
Yeah. So my final thoughts are this. I'm always grateful to have the opportunity to, share my story and share the stage with ACS and with Steve Wright and folks like himself. But another reason why I do this is because I'm so serious in saying this. The student lawyers, you guys have an important job to do, and you can do it. Your turn up can outweigh your turnout, though, or you'll be tuned out. So I'll say that again so you understand. Your turn up cannot outweigh your turnout. You will be tuned out, and you have an important voice and in this society moving forward. And we need lawyers to help litigate us back in the right direction or in the right direction in general in our criminal justice system. We will have many people who are our students who are inspired by the work that Steve and I do, but it may not just be for them, but there's still something that you can do. Whatever law you practice, even if you don't practice law, finding a way to contribute to this criminal justice pandemic, which we're in, is extremely important. And don't be afraid to use your voice, and don't ever, allow, someone to shake your opinion on what you know is right. And there's no way in the world we can say our criminal justice system right now is treating everyone right, because it's not. So I thank you guys again for the opportunity. And when I'm applying for my senior citizen benefits and you guys are running the country, I pray that you remember this day, that I inspired you guys, and give me a break on my taxes or something like that.
Thank you, Jarrett. Steve, final thoughts?
Thank you, and thank you. I thank you, Jarrett. I want to thank Jarrett for writing the book, and I want to thank ACS for having us. I think one thing that's incredibly important is that we remember how important the criminal legal system is. There's a tremendous amount of attention, thank goodness, that's being devoted to policing and the race discrimination that goes on in policing day in and day out in this country. But I will tell you that there's a lot of things that happen after arrest, after indictment, the exercise of discretion by prosecutors in deciding whether to seek the death penalty, whether to enhance penalties, whether to lock children up in adult institutions, whether to strike people in jury service based upon their race, all sort of decisions that are made in the legal system, which are racially discriminatory, which are destroying people, destroying families, and destroying communities. It requires our attention. We can't say that some people are the deserving poor and that other people are not. We have to recognize that all of the people and those in the criminal system are often the poorest and most powerless people in our society. And it's very important, both that ACS continue to put the spotlight on these issues, and also that members respond. And those of you that are in law schools or whatever, I just urge you to think seriously about whether being a public defender or doing some other kind of work in connection with the system is something that you would like to do, because the need is there. And it's important civil rights work. We have a long way to go. And as A. Philip Randolph would say, you move forward some and you come back some, and you move forward some and you come back some. But we've come a long way. Virginia, that's huge. What happened in Virginia, and things like that can happen in other places if we put our shoulder to the wheel and get us there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with that, I want to thank both Jarrett and Steve for this incredible conversation. Thank you to the many co-sponsors who supported today's event. If you're passionate about reform and justice, we also have volunteer projects through ACS that we're helping to staff, including research in police transparency and accountability, and working on truth, racial healing, and transformation resolutions at schools. If you're interested in getting involved, please reach out to us at campus@acslaw.org. And then a final plug for Jarrett's book, Redeeming Justice from Defendant to Defender, My Fight for Equity on Both Sides of a Broken System, which will be released September 14th, but you can and should pre-order now. And as Jarrett mentioned, he is such a great ACS friend, as is Steve. Invite him to speak at your local lawyer or student chapter. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.